Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to my session on a tiny introduction to complexity science. And also welcome to the first ever Global Regeneration Collab Expo. This is going to be a bit rushed. It's a lot of content, but what I'd like to say is please join my office hours and we can have a discussion. So what is complexity science? Since the beginning of what we call science today, the model has been to look at the world and our bodies as a machine, to take everything apart, analyze the individual parts, and assume that when we put all those parts back together again, they will function magically like a whole. But we know that connections are an essential part of any whole. So here comes complex systems, the idea of interconnected systems. And from that, we have living systems that are complex systems that adapt. So living systems are complex adaptive systems. Complexity science is the study of complex systems. So why am I introducing this in an area of regeneration? Our goal in regeneration is to be able to create systems that can regenerate themselves. Meaning when we do create a new system, whether it's a new marine area, a new coral reef, a new social system, new organization, what we want is for that system itself to be able to regenerate itself, to have the characteristics of a living system. In order to do that, complexity science provides the models, you can say the math, and the frameworks that will allow us to create such living type systems. Yeah. And we have Stephen Hawking, who foresaw the beginning of complexity era. And yeah, so I'm going to go into some key features of complex adaptive systems. I will not go in depth very much into them because I will focus much more on the applications of complexity science to our regenerative world. So complex systems, in this diagram, you can see the complex system is an open system, meaning its boundaries are open to constant input and output of external perturbations and information. There are feedback loops within the system which pick up this information, and in response to these internal and external perturbation, the system goes through changes, which occasionally are a large change called a phase transition, in which the system qualitatively becomes a different system. This is similar to a child going from being a child to a teenager, so passing through puberty, a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, water reaching a boiling point and becoming steam, and so on. Yeah. So the characteristics of such systems is that they're nonlinear, and we can see that with water going from liquid to steam. Its properties are completely different when it becomes steam. This is a non-linear transition. There are emergent properties, meaning the properties of steam are quite different than the properties of water. The things that cause the formation of steam, it's never a single cause. There are always multiple influences that affect the movement of a complex adaptive system. Most importantly, there's something called universality, the idea that there are underlying patterns that underlie the properties and dynamics of a complex system, that such patterns seem to repeat or seem to show up in a similar way across, you may say, all complex systems, despite there being in different fields, whether it's in biology or physics or ecology, etc. Yep. I'm going to focus on one such property, emergent properties, mainly because it is something that we live with every day, but don't realize it. Yeah. So these are the properties that make the whole greater the sum of its parts. And these properties emerge or are possible because the parts interconnect. So now you can see how the old sciences, by removing interconnections, made us blind to emergent properties. So Some examples of such is water, which we've gone through already, a bicycle. We design a bicycle with a handlebar, two wheels, but the purpose of a bicycle is to have balance in order to convey the human rider from point A to point B. But that balance does not exist in any of the individual parts of the bicycle, not in the wheels, not in the handlebar. The balance is an emergent property of the bicycle, the human rider, and the motion of riding itself. So the emergent property of balance, which is the property that we built the bicycle for, does not actually exist in any of the individual parts. It is a emergent property, but not the aggregation of the individual parts. That's important. It's not the aggregation. It's a nonlinear effect. Yeah. So I give here an example of the Schelling segregation model, which has become a classic. Thomas Schelling went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics. He showed how a random distribution of two types of individuals, the red and blue, if they chose just a 33% preference for people similar to themselves in their neighborhood, we will end up with a segregated society. Now, this is in by no ways a racist preference. However, the end result could look like racism. Yeah. Okay. So how do we then design our, how do we design for regeneration? How do we design everything we build such that it can be regenerative and carry the vitality of life forces in them? To give some examples, if we're solving for economic inequality, we're not trying to push people in the poorer classes up into the wealthy classes. What we want to do is that the system itself has properties such that the poor classes can move up comfortably and with the appropriate things that need to get done, rather than the system being the shape of a pyramid, which the pyramid forces the poor class to be larger than the upper classes. Now, I give an example of the rebuilding of Ukraine. This is very current in people's minds. I want to point out that the war forces a condition of warlike organizations dominating. But when we want to rebuild Ukraine, we want Ukraine to be rebuilt through its interconnections, through its societal structures, and we must nurture confidence. But in order to do so, we cannot rely on the warlike energies that got us to the point of rebuilding. We must switch out, and this must be done consciously. Yeah. Phase transitions, which I have shown is an important part of living systems. Here I give an example from Ayurveda on how it designs treatments to take the patient from a disease condition to a non-disease condition, guiding it through a phase transition. And ultimately, the phase transition allows for the human body to go into a new state that is free of the disease. I want to give here an example of some tools that we can use. One of them is called complexity metrics. Here is a very real example of how a general in Afghanistan, when he wanted to assess his own performance, he did not use operational metrics such as how many soldiers remain on the grounds, how many weapons have been used, how many terrorists have been killed. Rather, he said, how many girls are going to school? Now, this is very, very insightful, also very important, because if you look at the factors that involve girls going to school, you will see that all of these factors are also the same factors that cause a society to thrive. Yep. Such as confidence in law and order, confidence in education, accessibility of education, and relevance of education. So simply by moving from operational metrics to complexity metrics, the action of the army can go from destruction to thriving. I introduce complexity indicators, and here I'm using an example from Chinese medicine, where the assessment of the functioning of an organ, such as the liver, is not just about the liver itself, but also about the liver in its context, meaning its inflows and outflows. And so Chinese medicine doesn't talk about the liver as such, but rather the liver center. And it assesses the health of the liver center by how the liver center has moved from based on its inflows and outflows. So I take the example of the Dow Jones average, which is supposed to indicate the health or the movement of the market. But what it actually does is simply collects similar corporations, similar large corporations into a basket, aggregates them, and says, okay, now we have representation of the market. But again, this is highly reductionist. There is no value given to the connection of each organization to the market itself. So I propose something called the center of function model, where each entity is represented not just by the characteristics of an entity itself, but also all of its inflows and outflows. Now, here is a stark example of what happens if we don't understand complexity. This is a simulation in which I imposed a Gaussian curve on a social network type of a network, and showed how in low clustering environments, if there are certain edge effect phenomena in low clustering environments, those can potentially be randomly distributed. But in high clustering, they can potentially wipe out entire communities. Now, clustering is, of course, a characteristic of human societies, but it is also a characteristic of, say, forests, of the mycelium, of nature itself. So what are we eliminating? What entire areas are we eliminating simply because we don't understand complexity? Yeah. Leadership must change completely. Leadership must now become about wholeness. And this is about connections, about emergent effects, about understanding phase transitions, understanding how to hold things like complementary opposites together and not see them as conflicts that need to be torn apart and solved, so to speak. Finally, I talk a little bit about what it means to function as a whole, because what complexity science finally does is takes us human beings and brings us back to our wholeness, where reductionism in our past centuries tore us apart. So we see when we're at whole that even our felt experiences, our emotional experiences, and our intellectual experiences all come together to express themselves as a combination of our emotions and our intellect, a combination of intellect and intuition, and take our capacities to a whole different level if we know how to view them. So these four that I have given here, I apply them personally to my life and have found, and I'm going to speak to you very briefly about what transformational benefits they have given me. So empathy, which is generally thought of as simply caring for another human being, is actually the feeling of connecting with others and even connecting with things. And this connection allows us to provide, design, and even care for products and services. It raises the quality of what we output. Satisfaction is actually not like having a satisfying meal and filling up our bellies. Satisfaction is far more subtle. It is the combination of feeling good through all of our senses. And when we do that, if we really dig deep into our satisfaction, when faced with choices, having to make choices in the face of large number of options, look at your satisfaction and you'll find that the choice you make will always be optimal for you. Inclusion is the acceptance of what is by including ourselves, others, other things, and the world as a whole. Surprisingly, we are more ourselves. We are free to be ourselves by including everyone else. And finally, faith. Faith is unlike what has often been understood. It is not a religious um, artifact. It is actually a sense of our own completeness. It is the ground upon which trust and confidence can be built. So faith is a necessary part of living life. Thank you very much.